Hi, my name is Abraham Wickelgren, and I'd like to talk about my paper, The Effect of Consumer Inferences on Privacy Regulation When Information is Costly. First, I want to thank the George Mason Program on the Economics of Privacy for funding this research and providing valuable comments and a very interesting conference on the economics of privacy. So, what motivated me to do this paper is the fact that the US and the European Union take very different approaches to privacy regulation. The US, while requiring disclosures, puts the onus on consumers to read those disclosures and to make their own purchase decisions on the basis of whatever risks they assess. The EU, on the other hand, while allowing consent to play a role in some circumstances, does not always allow firms to do whatever consumers might consent to. Instead, it also relies some on mandatory prohibitions, and in other circumstances, obtaining consent is sufficiently costly that they're effectively mandatory. Now, if we think about both of these models, right, the US model makes intuitive sense when consumers are relatively well informed about privacy practices and the risks associated with data collection and sharing. Right, in that case, each consumer can decide based on their own personal risk tolerance whether or not to use a product or service, right? Whether the benefit to them outweighs their own personal risk. The EU approach, on the other hand, makes more sense if consumers have little or no information about privacy risks. If the government is much better informed about the risks and consumer preferences over privacy aren't that different, then potentially having a more informed government limit dangerous options might make some sense. But when we think about these two approaches, right, they sort of are appropriate in vastly different situations, right? What about sort of the big area in between? Consumers probably don't start out well informed about privacy risks, but they can choose to learn more about those privacy policies and the effects of data collection and data sharing on their own well-being. Doing so, however, is not easy, right? Generally, it's going to be time consuming and quite costly to carefully read over privacy practices, to do research on what the possible effects of data sharing might be, right? So in this paper, I try to analyze this middle ground and examine the effects of a laissez-faire regime relative to a more interventionist one by means of a relatively simple game theoretic model. So before getting into the results, first I want to give you an idea of sort of what are the key features of the model. So in the model, there's a monopoly firm that provides a product or service that can have varying levels of intrusiveness to consumers who use it. So the firm knows how intrusive its product is, right? What is the extent of its data collection and sharing? But consumers start off uninformed, and unless they spend some costly effort learning about it, won't know those risks. But they can spend some effort at a cost to learn what those risks are. Consumers also are going to differ in how much they're hurt by this data collection. So I think about this as sort of what is their vulnerability to privacy risks, right? There'll be more vulnerable consumers and less vulnerable consumers and those in between. There's also a regulator who's going to know the intrusiveness of the product and can decide to ban very intrusive products or not, right? And importantly, the consumer is going to know whether their government is interventionist, say, like if they live in the European Union, or more laissez-faire, like the US, when making the decisions about whether to become informed or to make their purchase decisions. So, what are some of my important findings? Right. So, first of all, very vulnerable or very invulnerable consumers are not going to become informed. Right. If you're a very vulnerable consumer, you figure it's very unlikely that you're going to want to buy a product. And if you do the research, it's going to be unlikely you're going to find that it's sufficiently unintrusive to warrant purchasing it, right? The same token, if you're an extremely invulnerable consumer, you don't care that much about privacy risks, then you're very likely to want to buy the product. And so there's not much point in becoming informed because even if it turns out to be quite intrusive, you'll probably purchase it anyway. Right. So the consumers that are going to become informed are those whose vulnerability is more intermediate. Right? And exactly what that threshold is of the lowest and highest level of vulnerability where consumers become informed is going to depend on the expectation of the regulatory regime. Right? If you live in a laissez-faire regime, then in general, those those thresholds for where you acquire information will be at lower levels of vulnerability than if you're in a regime which is more regulatorily intrusive. Right? Then when we come to think about purchase decisions, right, only the least vulnerable consumers are going to buy without becoming informed. And so those are the current consumers who are going to purchase the most intrusive products. Now, in general, we could have too much or too little consumption of these products, which are, very intrusive, which have sort of high privacy risks. And the reason for that is that there's sort of two conflicting distortions. On the one hand, we've got a monopoly product, so the firm's making profits, which tends to lead to prices substantially above the total marginal cost, and that leads to too little consumption. On the other hand, right, because the only consumers who are buying it are those who are uninformed, right? Some of those consumers are buying it because they know it might be very intrusive, but it might not be, right? And maybe if they knew it was intrusive, they wouldn't have wanted to purchase it, right? So we have these conflicting distortions, and we can't really say whether there's too much or too little consumption of very intrusive products. On the other hand, we can say there's unambiguously too little consumption of the less intrusive products, right? Because we have the cost of information actually deterring some consumers from learning that these products are relatively safe and inducing them to purchase it, whereas they wouldn't, not knowing the level of intrusiveness of the product. So with that sort of background, we can now think about what the effect of a more European style regulatory regime that prohibits very intrusive products, right? And the first, I think, important thing to note is that the benefit here is not that it's protecting consumers from intrusive products. These products actually generally increase social welfare. While it's possible, although as I said, certainly not necessary, that there's excessive consumption of such products, that just means that we have more consumption than might be socially optimal. It doesn't mean that overall the consumption benefits are negative. In fact, the overall benefit is still positive because these uninformed consumers are fairly rationally cautious, right? So the only consumers who consume it, right, who maybe shouldn't, are those whose losses are fairly small. And then there's other consumers who are even less vulnerable who have gains from that, right? So this is actually a downside of the European approach to privacy regulation. The benefit to that European approach, right, more stricter regulation, is actually in encouraging consumption of less intrusive products by making consumers worry less about the very intrusive products because they assume that those products wouldn't be available due to the regulatory regime. More of the somewhat less vulnerable consumers can purchase without expending information, right, without learning about it. And some of the even more vulnerable consumers will now find it worthwhile to learn and then purchase it if they find out the product is sufficiently unintrusive, protects their privacy enough. Lastly, the paper analyzes how the regulatory regime affects the incentives of firms to create these products in the first place. So the first sort of straightforward thing to note is that, of course, the possibility that a firm might develop a product that ultimately is banned is going to depress investment incentives under a stricter regulatory regime. But there will be a countervailing effect that there will tend to be greater incentives to develop less intrusive products to make sure that you have a product that you can sell. Now, it turns out if overall investment incentives are fairly weak because the product, say, is not likely to be profitable, the potential market might be small, then the first effect is likely to dominate and stricter regulation will likely depress investment. But if investment incentives are already fairly strong, say because firms anticipate a fairly large market, right, then it's more likely that at least a somewhat stricter regulatory regime will actually increase investment as firms are pushed to do more research to develop less intrusive ways of making their products in order to capture that market with a higher probability. So, overall, I think there's a number of important results here, right? Some of which I've just talked about. I think the other thing that kind of the overarching consideration is that privacy regulation really does need to consider how consumers are going to respond to that regulation, right? Consumers are not purely passive. At a minimum, this suggests that there's a benefit to a more consistent regulatory policy because consumers need to have accurate expectations about the regulatory regime in order to properly calibrate their information and consumption decisions. Stricter regulations that prevent voluntary transactions are a real cost, not a benefit of more intrusive regulation. But there is a corresponding benefit, which is that it provides consumers with greater confidence for the products that are available, that they are potentially less intrusive. So I hope you've enjoyed learning about this. And again, I want to thank the George Mason Program for the Economics of Privacy for funding this research. Thank you. Bye.